Welcome into another Because You Need to Know. This podcast is actually designed to share learnings and understandings and experiences from those in knowledge management, nonprofit work, and innovation. Today we're going to step into something that's pretty sci-fi. I have proposed the idea, how do I create a digital twin of me doing what I do? Today we're going to find out. I brought in two guests from the European Space Agency.
Marcel Henriquez
And
Henriquez
will be leading this conversation as we all learn, how can we do this? Welcome to the conversation. Say your name and your title.
Henriquez. I'm a senior knowledge management engineer at the European Space Agency.
Marcel Henriquez, Managing Director at Red Data Solutions.
In this conversation, I really want to touch on what's possible, what might be likely based on your experience doing this kind of stuff already. I do a podcast with folks all over the tech and knowledge management and entrepreneurial kind of world and nonprofit. So I touch on different things with different capacities. As I have been doing this series, Because You Need to Know, it has been mentioned and commented about multiple times that I have an ability, a capacity to get into deeper knowledge, critical knowledge and deeper knowledge that may almost be unconscious to the guest. The art that I bring in conversation is that in elucidation, meaning I can hear and reformat whatever was just said in a different way in order to confirm or deny that's what they mean, and ultimately to make it clearer for the listener. So I am an active component. It's not an interview. I don't ask a question, they give me an answer, and this whole back and forth thing. It's not a deposition. As Andrew said very clearly, I jump around a lot. And I think that adds to a level of authenticity to the conversation because they don't know what to expect. And I can kind of drive them verbally into a avenue they're not quite seeing because they're on the stage. But I can kind of steer them towards something that may be an aha moment. My intent is a legacy piece for something futuristic for Pioneer Knowledge Services is to have the capacity to build a model of how I operate. A digital twin, a artificial intelligence, an avatar, something that will be suitable, not just to do the function, but to build the trust in order to gather that tacit knowledge. That's the first foremost step. But the interactivity, to have levity, to have elucidation capability of, and not just to repeat, not to mimic and just repeat what they say, but to reformulate it, build a metaphor out of what they just said, and really play with it like Play-Doh and build something different. I'm open for who wants to talk next.
Okay, you don't mind, I'll kind of jump in because the way you described what you do, I would propose that it's almost the art of what you do. And I think that's actually quite an important consideration. You know, is what you do an art, or is it, like you say, a process? Is it discernible? Can we make it scientific? Can we create the Edwin equation rather than you are stylistic? You know, there is an art to what you do. And there's probably both. One of the things that when you raise this topic, one of the things I try to go back to is, you know, what do we have at the moment? What do you have at the moment at your fingertips? And that would be the series of podcasts that you have. And how might that be used in order to find this style? I think it's an interesting challenge. I mean, that's obviously why we're here today. I think what both Marcel and myself here, you know, we will try to bridge that gap between your vision and the reality that we know, and also what you already have. And that clearly one of those things is the podcast archive.
I think there's a good basis there to get something at least formulated in a learning profile. I agree. What I would think is that I would not use anything I've produced. I would go to all the raw material because I edit out a lot of stuff to the finished product. And I think you would want the whole enchilada in order to get all the intonations, where we went in conversation. The word that came up, and I've used it constantly since we published last year with this idea of the podcast in an organization to generate tacit knowledge. I consider myself a protagonist. That's my job. I'm not an interviewer. I'm a protagonist. I listen, I dig, I poke, and drive the conversations. Take that as the grain of salt of what I think would be needed for something to be super effective in a digital space that could actually bring goodness in an organization or with data outside of an organization.
What I find interesting is what you're saying about who you are, how you work, how you get people to make other assumptions or get that aha erlebnis. I think what's interesting for me as well, mainly the one translating something of an idea to an actual working software or system, is what is actually happening there. I think you are able to do that because you have experience with talking to hundreds of people from all different kind of alloys, all different kind of work capabilities, etc., etc. And that's, for me, that's basically the bridge to the system that we actually built for Andrew, because our system also has not one data source in it, it has 9 different data sources in it, which makes it possible to start, or at least, I'm not going to say it makes it possible to have an actual conversation with you and to poke or to ask the question in a different way or whatever, but it has the ability to let you search on. Like, I don't know if you know this, but if you go to YouTube, you always start with one video and you end up 3 hours later in a completely different, because it allows you to keep on going. And I guess that's something that you also do. It makes you a good podcaster. And that's something that in the long run, you would also like your system to be doing.
Are you saying then it would probably be just easier to digitally hook me up and map my brain and then just use that as the cortex?
No, because you have processed so many interpretations, opinions from people. You have all processed them. And those are all somewhere where you can say, okay, now I need to ask this question in order to get that flow going on the other side.
It's sometimes
Yeah.
sometimes you don't have to. Okay, so hearing you both, one of the things that Clark does, and you don't necessarily do, Edwin, and that is you don't necessarily know who you're talking to. But in Clark, it does. It knows the individual's name, it knows the individual's line manager, it knows their job function, it also knows something about their profile. And in a way, that gives the machine, if you like, some insight to answer questions that haven't even been asked yet, but provide useful and related knowledge. That's the first thing. So in principle, we could say, part of this capability would maybe be best served by having a short, I don't know, bio or something fed into the machine that says, it will help me interact with you if there are some basic things I know about you, and that will make it seem more natural and flow easier. The other is that when we started this Clark development, which is basically a development that uses knowledge graph and chatbot to link a user with a knowledge base. And it tries to establish, is that knowledge base, let's say, more knowledgeable? Does it have content that the user does not have? Or indeed, does the user have content that the system doesn't have? And can we create that two-way dialogue? In trying to come to that solution, Red Data, Marcel asked me a very basic question, and that is, how do you define AI? And in this case, I think we would also need to do answer the same question for the podcast. You're saying, okay, give me AI in podcast because I want basically, let's say, an intelligent being. Well, what we had to decide was, would we be driven by intelligence as we know it, or would the system be well informed? And that is two sides of a coin. So when you think about it, you could have a very intelligent system that's very good at asking questions, but those questions may be quite, let's say, poor in terms of content. So it has to be both. And what we found with Clark was we could overcompensate with being well informed. And that's what Marcel means about these 9 different databases. We made sure it was very well informed, And therefore, we weren't so reliant on the intelligence of the system to somehow derive knowledge. It was more accessible. And I don't think that's necessarily you go one way or the other. But I think it's important when you're looking at a solution, deciding whether or not it's suitable. I think that's a good criteria to judge it on.
Is Clark considered a generative AI, or is it just a search and find kind of thing?
At this point, it's a search and find.
Yeah.
And that's also one very clear requirement set by ESA, because we need the users to get the actual knowledge.
No fabrication, no
statistically. Exactly. It needs to be the actual knowledge.
Okay. Do you think that this application is more of a generative AI approach versus what Clark has a traditional feel for?
I would. It's interesting just to hear you talking, because Edwin, you mentioned something in your sort of prologue, which was actually really significant, and it touched on a few things, but one of them is trust. And I think that's really important. So I think ultimately what you want is a trusted conversation. The solution that you present, or indeed even the dialogue that you have with the user, I think fundamentally needs to be trust-based. And in that regard, you can actually use the retrieval, just simple retrieval of existing knowledge, say, to create that trust, but also then to further expand. And let me give you a classic example of how you work, Edwin. You know, you and I have worked on multiple podcasts. One of the things you do is you listen for keywords and you go and find a definition. And that definition then creates a basis of trust. You have gone away to go and get the definition. You are quoting the definition, and it promotes further exploration. So that is a simple retrieval, but it's a really important way of creating sort of factual dialogue, but also then stimulating a further conversation, maybe about the terminology that's used in that, or the range of, let's say, aspects within the definition that then either clarify, as in refine, or expand. Sometimes a definition can cause you to expand the dialogue. And that is just simple retrieval. But I think in the sort of, let's say, paradigm of what Edwin is, I think that's really important.
Yeah. I'll give you the tie back to where that kind of is established from. So I'm an old U.S. Army soldier, and I got into military intelligence with the U.S. Army. In every doctrinal piece that the U.S. Army has and produces and trains soldiers with, they have a glossary. There's a glossary for everything. And it is such a basic thing that I see most organizations don't bother with, that you get confusion just in conversation because words are not the same thing to each other. And in the work that I do, it's a selfish thing when Andrew says, I go fishing for, what the hell does that mean? What is the actual meaning of that? I think I know what I think it means, but I use it to clarify for myself that, okay, this is what we're talking about. So I like that idea of having that cast to a source to help drive. And I like the way you said it, Andrew, is that you either clarify or expand. And they usually end up being a hinge point for the next jog in the conversation, which I love doing because it brings a point of, oh, I guess I didn't realize it meant exactly that.
For me, another nice thing about is it brings a third perspective in the dialogue. So the dialogue is typically between, the interviewer or protagonist, as you say, and then the expert. But if you bring in a third perspective, and the way that it's done is, this is new to me and it's new to you. So there's no ownership. It's not Edwin saying, this is the way things shall be understood. It's offered. So there is an element of humility in there. And I think that's also part of what the tool should be. And we know from research, even back in the 60s, that human beings, we are very easily and very willing to attribute human attributes to talking robots. We look for that. And therefore, we're actually seeking that dialogue, and we are open to it. So I think that's something, as long as, you don't stretch the authority concept, that the protagonist is somehow the authority, but they are simply trying to enable knowledge to be talked about. And I think this concept of humility and offering opinion to expand thought, and it really is this concept of How can you create dialogue to expand thought? I think that's important.
And in the basis, you are, of course, talking about two different things. So generative AI is the way it produces an answer. And then you have another part which says, I want to mimic the way Edwin does his interview. So
Okay.
those are, in my opinion, two different things. You can also have let's say, a separate system or a separate model that says, I want my bot to talk exactly like and mimic Andrew's
Mm-hmm.
way of interviewing, exactly like he's doing now, with the complete with wording, with intonation, etc. But still be completely clear about where is my answer coming from? Is it generated? Is it statistical or whatever? Those are, in my opinion, you can see those as two different things.
I want to bring up a piece. I was teaching a class once at a university, and I came across for the first time. I follow tech. I'm not a tech person per se, but I look at what's coming 5 years from now. And there was a service, and I think it was out of England, that provided digital ghosts for people. Have you heard of this?
No.
Go ahead.
So it's freaking phenomenal. And this was probably 7 years ago. And I don't know if I got the right term. I just looked for it and I can't find it. But the concept is this. Somebody you love passes. You can hire this service to ingest all their texts, all their emails, all their voicemails, anything recorded. From that will create a generative, I don't know if it is generative, but it's responsive. It's somehow responsive. So you can text your digital ghost, and it creates this whole link in your head of,
Right.
Oh, he's still here, because it uses the same language, uses the same style, and that really kind of blows me away. And just as long as we're talking sci-fi stuff, and I guess that's not sci-fi because that's real, and I don't know how good it is, but still, somebody's doing stuff like this. The other piece is that there is a sci-fi book called, I've read the book and I've watched the series, Altered Carbon. Altered Carbon has the precept that you can upload your being to a disk, and then the human bodies are just shells. So you can basically live forever. You can produce the same body, or the technology is that you can needle cast foreign country like that, because it's all digits, and then occupy a shell of a body over there, do your business, and then needle cast back home. And the concepts are just phenomenal. And I'm way off track here. I got excited. But do you think there's a possibility, as long as we're talking this, can you duplicate a person's personality digitally?
As long as you have enough data, you can duplicate.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And with the new technology, you can also have the same voice. So now you have there are specific services that can really create your voice.
Okay.
And there's also technology that can make it as an image, either an avatar or a real-like image, where you probably have to have someone mimicking how you're. So it's recorded, and then they put your face on it. So that's all possible already. And I think those are interfaces. And I think those interfaces are going to be more mainstream within a couple of years. Yes.
The intent of the conversation is to prompt knowledge to be expressed by the expert. And that's actually a relatively limited conversation. In reality, it's actually quite a niche conversation. So I think the triggers that you're talking about, that's important. Some triggers might be from this bio. You might imagine that, in some cases, individuals might have written documents or papers and all of that could be pre-ingested. No, they might not. There may be a blank page, but, there may be a way of sort of pre-ingesting. And I liked your idea of this sort of, digital ghost. There may be a way of doing that to trigger or allow the bot, the avatar, to have this, because all it needs to be is meaningful, trustful and meaningful. You can have conversations with people, in the bus stop or something. You have a conversation, you say, that was a great conversation. They learned about 0.001% of what what you are, and do you know what I mean? So if the expectation is this dialogue, and I think the concept of protagonist is really just the way that you formulate the questions and you respond to the answers. So I think it's language used. And for sure, as Marcel says, the kind of verbal techniques that you use, I think could be copied.
Yeah.
You might be disappointed with that, but I think
Well,
they could be.
I dug a little more. They're called grief bots. Grief bots for your dead, passed on principles. So I guess what we've got right now, what would be an experiment that could be at least looked at? Now, we're a small nonprofit. It's not like I've got a war chest of funds. Could you give me an idea? Could we take written material, audio material, and I don't know how you would extract all your social media posts and all the text that you write, and I don't know how you get all that stuff. But if it were to be a consumption of everything that is, and I'm just thinking, so maybe a first iteration step would be to build an interface for Pioneer Knowledge Services just to access all of our stuff, all of our content. And maybe the interface is me or my voice, and I become the trusted agent to get to all this recorded content that nobody's going to listen to in its entirety, looking for answers.
You could make a map, because you have all those podcasts where you have people that you are interviewing. When they introduce themselves, they always say, I'm from this and this country. You can make sort of a profile of everybody that's been interviewed, not as writing a profile, but you can let some software
get some data points labeled.
Exactly.
To the yeah.
And when you're looking for someone who's into knowledge management at NGOs, you can find the right person on the map.
Okay, I like that.
I also like your idea, Edwin, because I think that's where I would recommend starting. I mean, I remember when we first started the Clark project, we were working with one particular organization that was new to us. And the first thing they did was they gave me a brochure of what they do. And in there was a big section. Very first section was get to know your data. I think that fundamentally what you're saying is totally true, is get your podcasts in a place where you can interrogate them, where something can interrogate them. There is interesting content in that. So, for instance, if you simply extracted everything that you have said, forget the other party, but everything that you have said, if you've got your texts, your transcripts, I know when we've talked, we've got these transcripts, then you would find, and maybe disappointingly, that you do have specific techniques. You might like to think that, yes, I'm an artist, but when you actually analyze it, you may find that you have key questions, techniques. We all like to have places in a conversation where we can think. So there may be some things that you say to kind of maybe rephrase things or recap on things or reflect on things. So I think that's, let's say, possible for sure, but it may be one of those things where you need to explore and see what you've actually got. But I think the fundamental, and Marcel is probably better to talk about this, is actually putting your data in a place where it's better retrievable. That may help you with user access. So if a machine can access it better, it also means that a person can access it better.
The transcribing all your podcasts can also have specific timestamps in it. So you could say, okay, I want to search through all my podcasts, and then it basically opens the podcast a few seconds before a specific type of knowledge is shared.
Does the technology allow for not creating transcripts, but to actually read audio and video files direct?
What do you mean exactly by read audio files direct?
As Andrew said, I generate transcripts from these. It's not a exact science. You get a lot of garble, and then you mix up who's talking, and it's not a great transcription service, any of that I've used. But does the technology have the capacity to just skip transcription and just use the audio and the video as the...
What they're saying about ChatGPT, I don't think it's called ChatGPT anymore, is that they are developing this like audio so that you can basically talk to ChatGPT and then it responds. It does work, but it slows the system down. But it's a very big but. Ultimately, whatever we're doing, so you're saying, can I go from audio to audio? The answer is yes, but it will always get into bits and bytes. It'll always get into zeros and ones. It will ultimately be as machine readable text. It might not be as human readable text.
So is that term, the word I was thinking of was natural language processing? Is it NLP? Is that right?
NLP.
All right. Well, so what do we do next?
You're the customer, so...
Well, I would propose an interface. That's basically what you're going to do next. We're going to create an Edwin avatar which is gonna speak like Edwin and give answers like you would do.
Okay.
I mean, just going to Clark, Clark is interesting to me because it sort of shows the two faces of a chatbot. The first face is when you start with Clark, it does two things immediately. One is it tells you it knows who it is and it knows who you are. We've already pre-logged it in. So it knows and it's telling you, I know what I am. These are these lessons in my systems. I know you. I can give you information. That's an important point. So that's the first part. The sort of second part of the introduction is it asks you how you are. It kind of get a sense. Now, it doesn't use that data, but it has that dialogue. That's not getting any knowledge from the person. That's establishing a relationship. It's establishing a connection. It's establishing a dialogue. And these things are all important. When you say to us, oh, I want a protagonist, well, actually, you will probably want 3 or 4 personalities. When I mean personalities, it's types of dialogue. You will want an introductory dialogue for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Hello, I'm Edwin's digital double. I hope you can understand. And then obviously the body of it is getting the knowledge, getting the dialogue to get the knowledge. But then there's also the end of the conversation, which is thank you for your time. All your data has been recorded. We found this very useful.
Maybe there's something like a follow-up you want to build in there. Do you want us to follow you up? Do you want us to send you something or whatever? That's also one of the possibilities. I think one of the other things, do you want it to be generative or do you want it to be actual knowledge? I think also in this case, I would say it needs to be something that's actual knowledge, and it depends for a little bit. It also depends on your user and what they are actually looking for. But I would say it's probably best to focus on actual knowledge, being completely transparent. This is what's been said. This is what's been.
So in that definition, though, if this is all conversational, is it any of it actual knowledge? I mean, what defines actual knowledge other than me pulling up a Merriam-Webster's definition of whatever? So I'm just curious, what are you saying is actual knowledge?
Basically, as you stated earlier, your glossary, your definition. Like you said, we always have a glossary in our document because that's the one thing.
So that's one thing I don't have in the conversational format unless I pull it. But in a system, we could easily establish that to add validity and clarity and just all that. Interesting. I like that.
Clearly, there's a skill in bringing it in at the right time. There is that skill. The other thing to sort of think about, which is very Clark-like, is that this entity, this digital entity we're talking about, could use the dialogue to make connections with previous, in this case, podcasts that you, Edwin, maybe are not able to do. We may end up with a capability that is more able in some areas, and less able in others. So, for instance, that dialogue could be, I've got 3 podcasts from the past 5 years.
As an internal business intelligence tool, that would be awesome because
I've got, 3 podcasts from the last 5 years that talk about this topic. This is the person, and this is where they're based.
I have a lot of content, and I couldn't recall any of it off the top of my head. So I think that would be an extremely useful retrieval and reuse, repurpose of content we've already generated.
Yeah, so there, you're actually using the podcast as a source of truth. At the time, it was truthful, and you can rely on it. You can say, this person said that. That's a truth. So you could actually use them a little bit like you use your terms and definitions. It says, okay, this is an interesting term. I'm going to find a definition. But also it could say, I can find a podcast that uses that term. And the tool in principle could also then, it would probably be pre-assessed. So each podcast would be pre-assessed for, say, keywords. So it could also say, yes, this podcast applies, but it was talking about this other topic or this related term. That is very much how Clark works, and that's how the knowledge graph works. We search on a term, but these are the related terms. These are the related people. Now, whether visually you present the knowledge graph to the person in real time, that's possible. Yeah, when we talk about the interaction, it doesn't necessarily just have to be a face talking, because it's digital, you could bring up so much more on the screen, on the interface, I should say, not the screen, but the interface. Yeah.
All right. Well, let's do that then. We get that next week. I like all of this. It helps me formulate in my mind what exactly is the use case. And right now I'm sitting on two of them. One is an external face and one's an internal face. And they're both interesting. I don't know how I would approach either or both as a project. Yeah, that's probably another conversation. But what is your bits of wisdom in that aspect of where is next?
Okay, so I think you have a very interesting use case, and there's no reason it couldn't be some academic study or project from someone at university. If you were looking for a research project or which way to go, that would be one way.
Mm-hmm.
I'll hand over to Marcel for the kind of what a business case might be.
I think in order to start, you need to, on the one hand, have, let's say, a number of scenarios that this is what I would like to reach in the end, regardless of technology you need, regardless of data you need, etc., and then work your way back. So let's say, okay, I want a chatbot to talk Edwin to users and help them with their knowledge management challenges. Okay, which data do we need for that? Is it one source? Are we focusing only on the podcasts, and can we transcribe those? Are they built up in the same way all the time, or are they completely different from each other? Those are all things that have an impact on your solution. And from there on, you start working your way to a data model, testing with the data, dropping it in some sort of repository where you start working on your knowledge graph, because basically the knowledge graph is part of every system that you are building AI on. And then you can decide on, okay, do we want to use a interface like we did with Clark? We have three different type of interface, three different type of personas that can use it. Or do I want one interface which can do everything? For instance, a chatbot like you have, well, mostly on customer service type channels, which says, okay, starts asking a question and starts giving you an answer. Within there's so much possible.
I appreciate the input and the interest as you were speaking of the use cases. I mean, ultimately, for future-proofing what Pioneer Knowledge Services is for, if I had a digital twin of me to do this level of conversation, then Pioneer Knowledge Services would just deploy me in multiple places and uses, and maybe one will be to continue the podcast, two would be to be hired by a company to drill down into a team or an individual to get that tacit knowledge and to make it a usable product for the organization, and or, you know, as you were speaking of the multiple facets of where do you pull the content from, you know, I'm thinking of the ISO for knowledge management. I mean, we could tie in most published material with a paycheck, I'm sure, in order to help constitute a really, what's your word for the bona fide knowledge, actual knowledge? Is that how you say it? What's your bona fide word for bona fide knowledge?
I just use the word truth. So we sources of truth.
Sources of truth. Well, that's definitive.
We go to what is the epistemologist's definition of knowledge. There has to be belief, and truth can still be truth in time. So it doesn't have to be truthful for all time as long as the temporal aspect is included. In 1988, this was true. So there's always metadata associated with truth, for sure.
I have a penchant in Old English, using Old English. And my wife hates it because I'll use words that she has never heard of in playing Scrabble. But I'll be like, oh, yeah, that's a word. 1600s. They used it all the time in the 1600s. How do I know that? I don't know, but I know it's a word. So,
very good.
Temporal. All right, my friends. Any final words before we wrap?
If you want to start with something like Clark or something AI, there's just a ton of possibilities at this point. I guess it's either start with digging in what are the possibilities. One other instance is if you are indexing your podcasts, there's also an AI summarizer, which works really nice, which helps you to get your podcasts more searchable, but on the smaller side. But those are also possibilities. There's just a ton of possibilities coming around. try to start small, think big. Those are the typical things always mentioned. It's kind of an open door, but still. And then see it through. And this is one discussion we always have with Andrew. It starts with the data. Do you have the data? Can we model it? Can we get it sourced? Can we parse it? Can we index it? It starts with the data. That's one of the things that AI just starts with the data.
And that's probably my least focused ability. That would be the first big hit. Go ahead, Andrew. You were going to say?
What data are you going to consider and what you're going to do with it? What I mean by that is that if you own the podcasts, that's your data to sell and nobody's going to charge you for using it. There is great potential. You said, there's knowledge management texts out there that you could include in order to become the authority on knowledge management. But whether it's really accessible, open, I have thought from our conversations, producing a free KM kind of website that says these are the things that are actually free out there you may not know. A lot of people don't want to dig through the text, and that's where machines are wonderful at it. But I think that idea of saying, like Marcel, start small and useful. For instance, really digitalizing your podcasts, if that has multi-use, so it helps you step forward, but it also allows what you've got already to be more attractive and usable and marketable, then I would go there. Mm-hmm. The world is your oyster, and AI sounds wonderful, but to get to know your data.
Okay.
And I think it flows from there.
I appreciate both of those perspectives. They're going to help. I'm going to compost a bit on all of this and see what ferments. Marcel, I've been dealing with some health issues. Andrew knows all about it. Okay. And so part of the instigation of why I'm heavy into this idea is that I don't know how many more suns I have on the planet. I really would like to figure out a way that I could model something useful, for the future that could add value. I'm excited about all this, and I thank you for the time you've given to help foster this concept. I think there's probably lots of people around the globe having similar conversations, maybe not this particular to conversation theory and building that trust piece. As you said, Andrew, that introductory piece has to be the critical, absolute first 100% right on attempt to the next piece. Because if you don't, like we've talked multiple times, that trust piece allows everything else to happen.
Yeah.
And trusting a machine may not be the easiest thing for people to digest. It might be easier than trusting people. It may just be the magic ticket everybody needed because they hate people.
Yeah, I do have a follow-on, which I didn't think I would have, but I do. I'm being introduced to someone who does podcasts. Scarily, they do podcasts on AI. I did think that we should bring him in. You may have to repeat a lot of the stuff you've said. Yeah. I think it might be interesting. Okay. He works in the scientific domain and trying to use scientific data for promote writing. To me, a very close and not much of a jump between writing and talking, because you're really constructing data and you're using the data in the right sequence. I offer that. If it sounds interesting and if it's not overloading, then I offer that.
I will take that lead, and why don't you connect me to that person, at least to start a relationship there, and then we say, hey, we're kind of kicking this whole thing around and see where it goes. Maybe He would be a complete player in that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, more the merrier. That's what I say.
Yeah, it's been fun, Edwin.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for your time and commitment and concern for the future. There is an old adage, one that you might have heard from a grandparent or village wise person, the one that says, you get out what you put in. Meaning your efforts are matched to some degree by the results or the output. Now take our nonprofit, Pioneer Knowledge Services, who delivers this cool program that you're listening to right now, takes a bunch of effort that you don't even see. We hope that you obtain value from our efforts to deliver it to your powers of reason. Here is where you come in. You, the listeners. Make our efforts rewarded. Consider donating to keep us moving forward. Visit pioneer-ks.org and click on donate.